Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 30, Volga Bulgaria, Part 1. Before we begin, a quick word of thanks to new patrons, State Councillor Judy and Boyar Demetrio, and another big thank you to Tsar Muhammad for his extremely generous support. There's a new members episode out on early Poland, and there will be some more background episodes on significant players in the story of the Russian Empire coming up. Thanks also to all of you subscribing through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, although I don't get notified of your names. Since the last episode, Anchor has finally completed its merger with Spotify, which presumably means a subscribe button will soon appear in the app to make it easier for those of you who listen on Spotify to subscribe. But for now, you still need to visit the website. Also, I have a bit of a cold, so this will be a shorter episode, and hopefully my voice will hold up. So let's just briefly recap what we've already heard about the Bulgars. The Bulgars emerged from the collapse of the Western Turk Empire with a Khanate on the Pontic steppe, usually referred to now as Old Great Bulgaria, although no one called it that at the time. The Khanate was fairly short-lived, coming under pressure from both the Byzantines, who didn't want another rival right on their doorstep, and the Khazars, as they established their Khanate. Following the collapse of this Bulgarian Khanate, some Bulgars migrated to the Danube, where they became the elite in a largely Slavic population, eventually assimilating and abandoning their own language, but giving their name to the new nation of Bulgaria. Other Bulgars remained within Khazaria, where they formed a large part of the steppe peoples who were transitioning to a sedentary lifestyle and forming the Saltiv culture on the western steppe and in the Crimean hinterland. While a third main group to emerge from the breakup of the Khanate gradually migrated up the Volga towards the region that includes modern-day Samara Oblast, the Republic of Tatarstan, and the Chuvash Republic. This group seems to have included several main tribes, the Bulgars themselves, the Suvars, a part of the major tribe in Khazaria from which the Khazars themselves may have derived. They would go on to be the progenitors of the modern Chuvash people, the Balanjars, and if you recall the episodes on the Khazars where Baranjar was one of their capitals in the Caucasus, you'll understand why scholars believe they were probably a breakaway Khazar group, possibly mixed with Alans, and perhaps one that did not accept the conversion to Judaism, and there were a number of others. The migration northward was not as rapid as, say, the Magyar move from the Urals west to Hungary. It took place over a couple of centuries. The end result was the Bulgars and their confederates becoming the dominant force on the Middle Volga, first as Khazar tributaries. With the arrival of the Rus, troubles in the south, there was major growth in trade flows switching from the lower to the Middle Volga that led to the consolidation of the early Volga Bulgar state and growing independence from the Khazars. By the time period we have been looking at in recent episodes, with the Rus established in Kiev, Volga Bulgaria had already formed into the beginnings of a powerful state, a process that will be completed with the fall of Khazaria, which will be coming up very soon. It is one of the largest states in Europe, its capital city is bigger than London or Paris, and it is, I think, the first Muslim state in Europe. I'm not counting Spain as it was invaded by North African Muslims. As we have already heard with the much-mentioned Ibn Fadlan, It had begun leveraging Islam to obtain additional knowledge, technology, and further develop trade routes directly to the Caliphate and Central Asia without Khazar involvement. So, over the next couple of episodes, we're going to take a more detailed look at early Volga Bulgaria. To start, let's revisit the question of Bulgar migration and take a look at who else was already living on the Volga. One of the key factors in the Bulgars being able to move into the region and establish dominance was that they already had experience of independent statehood. This was in contrast to the existing population on the Volga and the foothills of the Urals, which was still organized largely around extended family villages. This meant that the Bulgars moved into the region not necessarily with a massive numerical advantage over the local inhabitants, if they had been able to come together, but with a different worldview and a higher level of organization. Initially, the Bulgars based themselves in the area from the Samara Bend to the confluence with the Kama. The modern Samara Oblast is the southern neighbor of Tatarstan. They were not the first Turkic people to reach this area. Orhov tribes had already been present for some time. There was also the Imenkova culture, a Baltic Slavic group spread across the region, the Magyars on the Trans-Volga steppe, and in the east a variety of Ugrian peoples. During this period, there was a contest for hegemony between the Bulgars and the Orhov tribes already in the region, with two strong alliances formed by the Esagels and the Barsils to oppose the Bulgars. Although we don't know the details of the process, it's clear that by the beginning of the 9th century, the Bulgars had won, perhaps with support from the Khazars. We're still a couple of generations away from definitely knowing the name of the Bulgar ruler, but we do know that he was giving himself the title of Eltabir, a king subject to a Khan, which indicates that he recognized himself as subordinate to the Khazar Khan. We can also make the assumption that the early Volga Bulgarian state was similar to other Turkic contemporaries, so the Bulgars would have formed a military and service elite working for the ruler, with the leaders of the other tribes and peoples aligned with their confederation being a rung lower on the ladder. So the Rus, or their Scandinavian precursors, arrived on the Volga at just the time in the Bulgar state formation where they were in a position to take advantage, and the Rus became the catalyst to transform them from an outlying dependency of the Khazars to a significant kingdom in their own right. The Rus connected the Bulgars to Europe and brought a new trade boom. This trade funded the Bulgar state apparatus, and the shift in center of gravity from trade with the Islamic world via the Khazars to trade via Bulgaria tilted the balance of power from Atil to Bulgar. Volga Bulgaria saw much of the same development that we have already seen in Rus, but earlier and faster. New settlements appeared to service merchants. Official posts were created to control and protect the routes and levy customs duties. Local production was stimulated by the access to new markets. As in Rus, these processes drove the concentration of elites and the creation of administrative centers and structures. Scandinavians also congregated in these centers, with archaeological finds showing their presence around the major cities of Volga, Bulgar, and Suvar. Bulgar state formation was also reinforced by successive waves of migration. The first wave was, as mentioned a few minutes ago, following the collapse of Old Bulgaria. It can be traced in burial sites tracking north to the Samara Oblast over the 7th and 8th centuries. A second wave followed in the middle of the 8th century and comprised Bulgars moving from the Don towards the Middle Volga. If you recall our episode on the Khazar economy, Many of the Bulgars who had remained in Khazaria had begun to sedentarize, forming part of the Saltiv culture. The grave goods for this second wave showed them clearly bringing Saltiv-style ceramics with them. Some scholars link this migration to the setbacks the Khazars experienced in their wars with the Arabs, when they were pushed to move their center from the North Caucasus to the North Caspian. The third wave of Bulgar migration took place in the second half of the 9th century. Scholars link this to the Khan converting to Judaism. Some are going so far as to claim there was a civil war in Khazaria. However, this is really conjecture based on pieces of evidence such as this Bulgar migration we're talking about. It's really not more than a guess that if there was a migration, there must have been a cause, and the conversion to Judaism was a significant event, so it could have been the cause. There is no written record of a civil war from Byzantine, Arab, or Khazar sources. At the end of the 9th century, there was a final fourth migration of Bulgars caused by the intrusion of the Pechenegs into the western steppe. As mentioned in previous recent episodes, this led to the destruction of settlements in the steppe and the adjoining forest steppe zone, and essentially ended the Saltiv culture there. Bulgars, who had settled under the Khazar Khanate, were a significant part of the Saltiv culture, which you'll recall was comprised of steppe peoples settling down and adopting a more agricultural, although still predominantly pastoral, lifestyle. As the Slavs, displaced by the Pecheneg onslaught, moved back into the forest and north into Rus territory, the Bulgars headed to join the Bulgars on the Danube or Volga, or to Crimea to territory more securely under Khazar control. These successive waves of Bulgar migration increased the predominance of Bulgars in the emerging state and reinforced their political and cultural influence over the other Turkic groups and the Finno-Ugrian population. The final wave of migrants, who had by this time already fully adapted to a settled lifestyle before their displacement, are also linked to the establishment of the first permanent settlements among the Volga Bulgars, and archaeological finds across the region show a strong presence of typically Saltiv ceramics. It is difficult to precisely define the borders of early Volga Bulgaria. Geographers from the Islamic world placed it in what they called the seventh climate, the coldest zone of the inhabited world, which they identified fairly unspecifically as the Land of Darkness north of the Black Sea. The Land of Darkness seems to have been quite a common name given to anybody living away north. The Arabs thought the Bulgars were living at the edge of the world, but the Bulgars had their own people further north that they thought were living at the edge of the world. Ibn Rushda's Book of Precious Records from 913 states, quote, "The Bulgar land is bordered by the Burtes land. The Bulgars live on the banks of the river that flows into the Khazar Sea, known as Atil. Their country consists of marshlands and primeval forest." Unquote. Lying at the edge of the steppe, the forests of Volga Bulgaria were probably nowhere near as dense as those further north, nor was it particularly swampy, but it looked that way to Arab travellers. Ibn Fadlan was also amazed by the forest that he saw. Some Arab geographers placed the western border on the edge of Slav territory, making them neighbours, while others write that they were separated by some distance. North and south borders were a bit more complicated. Wherever exactly Volga Bulgaria was, it was the extreme edge of the Islamic world, and scholars were often working from third-hand reports and contradictory evidence. Mahmud al-Kashgari thought that Bulgar and Suvar were near the Caspian. Not true, but probably he had heard correctly that many Bulgars lived in Khazaria, including in Atil, and therefore he guessed their placement on that basis. Archaeological work since the 1970s has brought more clarity, with over 2,000 Bulgar sites dating from the pre-Mongol period excavated across the Volga-Kama region, ranging from individual graves to almost 200 towns. The evidence shows Bulgar settlement as far as the Perm region, although it was sparser there and most likely connected with trade. But the center of Volga Bulgaria was on the Middle Volga. This area is quite geographically diverse, ranging from dark spruce forest to light pine and broadleaf forest, forest steppe meadows and groves, open grassland and black earth. There are some upland areas of 300 meters or so and lowlands around the rivers. The Volga meets numerous tributaries here. The major ones divide the region into distinct areas. The largest is the Kama, nearly 2,000 kilometers long. It rises in Udmurtia and has a greater flow than the Volga at their confluence between Kazan and Ulyanovsk. The Trans-Kama region runs south from the Kama on the left bank of the Volga. In case anyone finds this terminology confusing, left and right bank is determined by the direction of flow of the river. So although you might look at a map and think that the left bank is on the western side, it's actually the other way around. The western part of this region, between the Sheshma and the Kama, was the core Bulgar territory in the pre-Mongol period. This is a typical forest steppe area, with wooded valleys and open meadows. It has excellent soil, around 70% black earth, and the Bulgars grew wheat, barley, millet, peas, flax, and hemp. Around half of the main Bulgar archaeological finds are here, including Bilyar, the great city on the Mali Cheremshan, Suva, Bulgar, and other towns. The eastern part of the Trans-Kama region is the Bugulma Plateau, running out towards the Zhiguli Mountains. Although there would be later Bulgar settlement here, it's believed to have been barely inhabited in the pre-Mongol period. The pre-Kama region is the region north of the Kama on the left bank of the Volga. The Vyatka, another major tributary, runs through it, dividing it into east and western parts. This region was dark forest, with no black earth and low humus forest soils, so less amenable to agricultural settlement. Bulgar settlement in this area came somewhat later in the 10th and especially 11th and 12th centuries. The Kazanka Basin, where a fortified trading outpost called Kazan was built around the end of the 10th century, has the most northerly archaeological finds of pre-Mongol Bulgars. On the right bank of the Volga, there is the pre-Volga region. It's generally higher than the left bank, reaching almost 400 meters in the Zhiguli Mountains. This area was forest steppe down to steppe at the Samara Bend. Some of the first Bulgar settlements took place in this region, with finds dating back to the late 7th century. So if you try to match what I've just described to a modern map of Russia, you'll see that it extends well beyond the current Republic of Tatarstan and includes a substantial area that now lies in neighboring regions. The pre-Mongol territory of Bulgaria ran from the Kazanka in the north down to the Samara Bend, from the Sura in the west to the Bielaya and Yaik in the east, an area that's comparable in size to modern Germany. Volga Bulgaria was a major medieval European state. Looking at that map will also show how well situated Volga Bulgaria was for trade, controlling both the biggest and best river for merchant shipping and the entry point for trade caravans crossing the steppe from Central Asia into Europe. And the Bulgars built on their steppe commercial heritage to take full advantage, becoming fully comparable to the Rus in the Eurasian trade. Marketplaces, both permanently operating and seasonal, were organized at towns and meeting places of routes, with facilities to support merchants. Ibn Fadlan described rows of Scandinavian-style wooden halls next to a marketplace on the Volga, and caravanserai were built for traders from the south and east. Caravanserai originated in Central Asia to provide shelter and protection to merchants, and eventually spread along the trade routes from North Africa to China. They were larger than roadside inns, typically a walled compound around a central open courtyard, with a single defensible gate, stabling for animals, merchants selling supplies, bathhouses, and other facilities that travellers might need. In the Muslim era, they often included a mosque. The remains of a caravanserai found near Bilyar also include a Scandinavian-style sauna, showing that the Rus may have been using them as well. The Bulgars originally used furs as the medium of exchange, as we've heard the people of the region had been doing for centuries. This has left traces in the language to this day. The word tien means a squirrel and a token for exchange or coin. And there is a proverb, tien rashtan arashka, tien kuldan kulha suker. A squirrel jumps from tree to tree, and a coin jumps from hand to hand. The rapidly developing trade routes of the 9th century saw the Bulgars transitioning to the use of metals and then to coins. As well as the influx of silver dirhams from the Islamic world, they minted their own. There's some controversy over when the first Bulgar coins appeared, as some scholars treat some coins as Khazar coins in circulation in Bulgaria rather than local coins, but it seems clear that they already existed before the fall of Khazaria. Western coins have also been found at various sites, although in smaller numbers than dirhams. As the value of a coin at this time lay in the amount of metal it contained, whichever it was, the origin of the coin was not so critical to its use, but minting your own coins was a matter of prestige. Alongside coins, particularly after the flow of dirhams from Central Asia was reduced, ingots, especially of silver, were also used. These would be weighed using the scales found in graves all across Bulgaria and Rus to determine their value. The ingots were called som, which gives us the names of the modern Uzbekistani currency, the som or sum, and the Tajikistani somoni. Certain other items were also used in place of money by the Bulgars and the Rus: spindle whorls, necklaces, beads, and seashells that had passed through merchants all the way from the Maldives. These reached the Bulgars because they were the center point of the greatest trade route between Europe and Asia of their day, joining and driving the development of Turkic, Slavic, Finno-Ugrian, and Scandinavian peoples. The route became particularly important as conflict between Arabs and Christians in the Mediterranean blocked other routes, and as the development of northwestern Europe drove the demand for luxury goods. The Volga was far more favorable to river transport than the rocky Dnieper. Rather than dugouts, merchants used vessels with a beam of up to 3 meters and a length of up to 10 meters, capable of carrying a substantial cargo. The Bulgars sat at the most advantageous position. While it is true that the Khazars controlled the entry to the Volga, we've already heard that they lost this trade, as merchants preferred to cut them out by heading straight across the steppe and joining the river higher up. So the Bulgars controlled what came up the river into their territory, but also what came over the steppe and met Scandinavian and later Rus, Russian, and other European merchants also in their territory. And if Scandinavians wanted to pass through to meet Central Asia, they controlled and taxed their passage too. The route along the Volga connected the Baltic Sea to the Caspian and to Baghdad beyond it. The route along the Kama into the pre-Urals was known as the Fur route, and the east-west route ran from Khwarezm, an oasis region on the Amudarya Delta that lies in modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, through Bulgaria to Kiev and on to Western Europe. Al-Balkhi wrote that it took 1 month to get from Atil to Bulgar by land, 2 months going upriver, and 20 days downriver. Al-Masudi described caravans that ran continuously between Bulgar and Khwarezm. This was the route that Ibn Fadlan took as he travelled from Baghdad. The Islamic writers also mention the route from Bulgar to Kiev, saying that it took 10 days to reach the border of the Rus, and then 20 days to Kiev. The Bulgars traded the same goods we've already heard the Rus dealing with: furs, wax, slaves, supplying the luxury markets of the Islamic world with high-quality furs just as the Rus did the Byzantines. This is part of the reason why the Volga, despite being a huge river running more or less north-south, did not become a natural border. Instead, the Volga was where different peoples met. Scandinavians, Rus, Slavs, and Arabs were not the only travelers here. Persians, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Jews, Balts, Frisians, and Saxons also journeyed along the Volga trade route. Important Rus towns, Murom, Suzdal, Rostov, and Vladimir, appeared on the northwestern stretches of the Volga and its tributaries. Further south, as steppe nomads encountered the river, they also settled, starting their own cities and agriculture. Volga Bulgaria developed major settlements at Kazan, Volga, Suva, Bilyar, Orshil, and other places. The Volga trade route drove urbanization, making the cities here comparable in size and wealth to Atil or Kiev. This confluence of trade routes was also what drove Volga Bulgaria towards independence from Khazaria. It became unclear what Khazaria was doing for them in terms of providing protection, and the wealth flowing into Bulgaria was wealth that was flowing away from Khazaria. This meant a stronger Bulgaria that could pay for its own military force and ask the Caliphate to send them experts to help build fortresses, while the Khazars' ability to do the same shrank. Arab writers commented on the tight trading relations between the Bulgars and the Rus. Al-Istakri wrote that the closest people to the Bulgars were the Rus, whose king lived in a city called Kuyaba, that's the Arabic for Kiev, a city bigger than Bulgar to which people travel on trade affairs. The tale of bygone years has its own references, which we'll be encountering soon. The slave trade was particularly noted by Islamic writers, who wrote that the Rus captured slaves from various places further north and west and brought them to Bulgar to sell. The majority of the enslaved captives, mainly Slavs and Finns, were sold on to Khwarezm. Listen to Members Episode 4, The Northern Slave Trade, for a more detailed look at this subject. Alongside being trade intermediaries, like in Rus, Bulgar artisans were starting to develop local production. A speciality was bronze zoomorphic locks. They may initially have been modelled on locks from Persia, but were soon being produced in Volga Bulgaria and sold across the region. Locks in the shape of a horse seem to have been particularly valued and have been found at numerous Rus and Baltic sites. Bulgar ceramics were also traded. A significant percentage of the ceramics found in Kiev is Bulgar, with smaller amounts found in other cities. It even appears to have influenced Rus ceramics. Late 11th and 12th century Russian ceramics have similarities to Bulgarian ceramics from the previous century. As previously noted, metalwork was more developed in the Volga region than it was in the Slavic parts of Rus in the early Rus period. And so jewelry and copper utensils were also made in Bulgaria and traded to Rus cities. Trade with what the Bulgars called the Dark Country, the region lying northeast into the Urals, inhabited by Finno-Ugrian tribes, was also important. The Bulgars were, of course, buying furs. In exchange, they sold metal utensils and weapons imported from the Caucasus, Byzantium, and Central Asia onto the fur hunters. They also sold a large amount of silver jewelry of Bulgarian manufacture. The Bulgars had opened up this trade with the Taiga and as far as western Siberia, even before Volga Bulgaria had formed, and probably a couple of centuries before the Rus got involved. Steppe peoples had reached into the forest steppe belt since the 7th century. Their presence can be traced through the spread of shaft and blade weapons, decorated armor, and horse trappings, as well as the silver jewelry. Initially, most of the goods came from the Khazars, but as the Khanate lost control over the Middle Volga, Bulgar goods took over and dominated in the Taiga and western Siberia for several centuries. Numerous finds have been made on the Ob River, the most westerly of the three major rivers in Siberia, flowing from the Altai Mountains into the Arctic Ocean. These include Persian, Khwarezmian, Byzantine, and Syrian dishes, as well as Bulgarian items such as silver bowls chased with floral patterns or images of mounted archers, silver wrist guards for archers with floral and animal designs, filigreed and gilt headbands and pendants, cups decorated with horses, and other similar items. The intensification of this highly lucrative trade was a source of competition and conflict. It triggered sporadic warfare among the Finno-Ugrian peoples that hunted the furs. But on a larger scale, the arrival of the Rus and Scandinavians who sailed around the Northern Sea to reach the mouth of the Ob during the medieval warm period brought serious rivals for the Bulgars. But that is a story for later in the podcast. Thank you for listening, and join me next episode for a look at the early rulers, state structure, and conversion to Islam of Volga Bulgaria.